Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone. This is Amy Biancoli. Our guest today is Banning Lyon, author of The Chair and the Valley, a memoir of trauma, healing, and the outdoors. An account of the abuse he suffered after being hospitalized in a psychiatric facility at age 15 and the long journey toward joy and awe that followed. His memoir was published this spring by Penguin Random House. He first wrote about his experiences in 1993 for the New York Times and, more recently, for the Washington Post. Based in California's Bay Area, Lyon is an outdoor educator and backpacking guide whose engagement with nature was a key force in his recovery. His website is banninglyon.com, and that's Lyon with a Y. Banning Lyon, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for writing this book. I have to say that I shed a lot of tears while reading it, and I tore through it. It's a fabulous read. And I didn't just cry during the difficult parts, and there are some incredibly tough parts, really painful, but there are also moments of profound beauty, start to finish. And that's part of what really struck me about your book. But the pain beauty thing, that almost the yin yang, leads, in a way, it kind of leads to the story itself, because the title and the subtitle really convey that. You've got the chair representing the horrendous trauma you experienced while hospitalized, and then other trauma later on. And then you've got the valley, the healing you found in nature. So the reader knows going in that that's the arc of the story toward healing. There are no spoilers there, but I'm going to do my best not to give away too much, because as I said, it's a gripping read. It really is. So if you don't mind, if we could just start with the chair, with your hospitalization. How did this story start? What was the chair?
So the Reader's Digest version, which is always hard for me to deliver because there's just so many details. But my parents had a really bitter divorce. I went through a custody battle. I was bounced around from place to place. And then ultimately, my mom had me moved to Dallas to live with some aunts and uncles, where I got bounced around from house to house a little more. And then ultimately landed in a room above my aunt and uncle's garage with my mom until she could find a place for us to live. And during that period, I became kind of this bitter, angry skate punk. And, I fell in love with skateboarding and punk rock music. And that really gets poo-pooed a lot. But the value, the really deep, profound value of having found both a community and what felt like people who understood me through the punk rock and skateboarding community was really sort of the first, in many ways, family that I found. I felt as if I belonged for the first time in my life, and people who understood the sort of betrayal of going through a divorce and being bounced around, and so I still to this day I really deeply identify with the punk rock community and skateboarding and stuff, because it really gave me a home. It was really my first home, and so through a series of sort of bizarre coincidences or events, my best friend broke his skateboard. I decided to give him mine because I wanted to go skating with him, but it wasn't really altruistic because I wanted also to use it as an excuse to buy a new board. So I do all this in a matter of hours, and my school counselor, who I'd never spoken to in my life, interpreted this along with all sorts of other things that she completely misinterpreted. Like, for example, I had written suicidal tendencies on one of my books. It's a band, great band, but she misinterpreted this as my having been suicidal, along with my giving away my most prized personal possession, and the fact that this woman had never spoken to me, and the fact that I also was into punk rock and I looked weird, and she didn't understand me at all. So she called my mom and said, "Your son's suicidal because he had given away his skateboard." So my mom confronts me when I get home, and I'm like, "No, I bought my favorite skateboard. I'm going to go out skating." And she's like, "Absolutely not. We're going to go see this therapist who I was seeing at the time to help my mom and I sort of get along." And this whole situation was explained to him. And so he's like, he tossed his hands up and he's like, I don't know what to believe. And And so ultimately through this, over the course of 24 hours, they decided to put me in a psychiatric hospital for at the time, what they told me would be a 2-week evaluation, which in the mind of a 15-year-old was an eternity. I mean, 2 weeks to a 15-year-old is an eternity. So I was like, absolutely not. But he said, look, we don't want to force you. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? Because I was a minor. So I went ahead and agreed because I was like, okay, 2 weeks. And it turned out to not be 2 weeks. And it turned out to not be anything like the hospital that I had imagined in my mind. It was a horrible, horrible experience.
And, you're telling this story and reading it in the book. It's just, I was flabbergasted. And yet, you can be shocked, but not surprised because you shouldn't be surprised when you hear stories of people not being listened to. But here you are, this kid, and what you're describing, so many kids they're looking for community at that age. Their adolescence is a rough time. And nobody listened to you when you said that you weren't suicidal. And to me, that's one of the huge, huge points in your story is that if this all could have been avoided if someone had listened to you.
There's a lot of reasons that I wrote the book. I didn't want to write an expose. Those have been written. Like people have been writing about the troubled teen industry for ages, and it's still happening. So clearly, the attempt to try to shed light on this industry is not working because people are doing it, and it's still happening. So I was like, I'm going to take a totally different tack and just tell my story. I wanted the reader to feel as if they were living my life with me over my shoulder. I didn't want to interrupt them. I didn't want to sort of break the illusion that they were in my head, sort of watching my life, living it with me. So I wanted that to be the way in which I told my perception of the troubled teen industry through a different sort of lens. And one of the reasons that I did that is because this is still happening to kids. Kids still feel this way. They're still not being listened to. In fact, if anything, I think it's more of an epidemic today than it was back when I was younger, because there are so many jaded, discontent, upset, angry, bitter teenagers nowadays that just don't feel like they're being listened to. And with the pandemic, it's very much my prediction that there is going to be, if not already, some sort of movement to sort of scoop up these kids and create in the years to come, a sort of new industry to help the pandemic kids that sort of were delayed because of the social repercussions of the pandemic. So my point in bringing this up is that not only did I not feel listened to, but these issues are still very much alive today. And I really wanted my book to sort of make that clear to people that this is not something that just happened in the 80s. This is still happening.
Right. And that was actually something I was going to bring up in a bit, is this move to not just listen to people, but pathologize them. I mean, pathologize teens, pathologize people in distress, saying, okay, we're going to stop listening to you and we're not going to treat you well because there's XYZ wrong with you, or you're behaving in a certain way, or you're doing things in a way that don't fit. So I want to get into that a little bit more later, but for the listeners right now, they've heard the title of the book, and maybe they're curious about why the chair represents trauma. And I'm assuming this has got to be something that's hard for you to discuss. It was hard to read, and it's going to be hard for listeners to hear. But if you could describe it right now for them, what happened in that hospital, in that chair.
My first month in the hospital began on an adult assessment unit where there really were no other teenagers. There was one that I recalled for like 3 days, and then he was gone. And very much like you said, they just sort of pathologized me. They were like, you suffer from severe depression. You're not able to make meaningful relationships. They just told me all this like bullshit. And so I kept trying to explain to them, like, I just gave my skateboard away. So after a month, they said, look, we're going to send you to the adolescent long-term unit, which was literally the entrance to it was 100 feet from where I was. So these are locked psychiatric units. a double series of locked, magnetically locked doors. So they escort me out of that assessment unit. They walk me across what we called the rotunda, and shaped vaguely like the Pentagon in a way, and then into the adolescent long-term unit. So in the adolescent long-term unit, the first thing I saw was what we called a unit meeting, where there's a bunch of teenagers sitting in sort of a loose circle. And in the corner of the room, there was a girl who had been strapped to a bed with leather straps. She looked like a cave girl. Her hair was black and matted, and she just watched me with this sort of very haunted look that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And minutes later, when the unit meeting splits up, my roommate comes in and he's strapped to a wheelchair. And so he's rolling around. And he sort of explains to me that night, from what I can tell and what I learned throughout the weeks that follow, that this girl had been strapped to this bed for months, and ultimately by the end of my stay, and I didn't learn this till much later, she had been strapped to that bed for 18 months straight. And a very close friend of mine from the hospital spent 333 days in a body net. He had to have physical rehab, learn how to walk again. This was standard operating procedure in my hospital. These were not outliers. This was not an anomaly. This happened all the time. And we witnessed a ton of violence. And one of the sort of artistic just decisions I had to make in the book was the violence that I describe in the hospital, which is very graphic, happened on a near daily basis. I was workshopping my book, and people in my workshop were like, "You have to stop bringing this in. I can't hear this anymore. I can't listen to this." And so I had to make this decision to not beat the reader over the head with this, because I wanted them to get to the beautiful stuff of the book. So I really needed to sort of tone down the hospital to make it palatable, because normal human beings don't understand what that place was like. I was put on what the doctors called chair therapy. So I kept forgetting to close my door. They would give me these demerits called 30-minute chairs, where I had to sit in a chair for 30 minutes and think about why I had forgotten to close my door. It was clearly punitive. And so I kept forgetting to close my door. So my doctor said, "Okay, we're going to put you on permanent chair in your room without meals," which means I had to sit in my chair facing the wall. A good day was 6 hours, 7 maybe. A bad day during summer vacation, when there was no school to keep me out of my room, was 10 to 12 hours of sitting chair, facing the wall, feet flat on the floor, hands on my lap. I can't make eye contact with anybody. I eat meals in my room because that was supposed to help me. So I was on chair until the day I left the hospital. That lasted 11 months. And so I didn't go outside for 5 months. The one time I went outside was for just a few seconds. I didn't go outside again for many more months. Like I said earlier, it's not something normal people will ever understand, because the conditions were inhuman. And so one of the things that I try to describe in the hospital portion of the book is that I began to sort of dissociate. So I began to sort of build this wall between me and everybody else, because I saw people begin to really snap and become very violent toward themselves. And, they would tear out their hair, or try to gouge their own eyes out. They'd bite themselves, because you just lose it. You get dehumanized and you have no dignity anymore. And these were totally normal kids, that ultimately are just sort of dehumanized to the point where they have nothing to live for. So, and this is another point in writing the book, was that I wanted to really sort of communicate to people how traumatic it is, not necessarily to just be abused, but in many ways, it's almost more traumatic to witness abuse and to be powerless, and to not be able to help people that you witness being abused. And so that was something that happened to me a lot in the hospital. And to this day, it's the stuff that's hardest for me to talk about. And so I just sort of became numb. I sort of anesthetized myself, and I would see this violence every day. And I was like, okay, it just sort of became a film to me. And that was how I survived. And I still have that tool to this day. And and it's both a very good tool and a very bad tool. It interrupts my life. It made creating deep emotional connections with people very hard for a long time. It's something I still have to really work on a lot. And so when I left the hospital, I was just a complete disaster. I was 1,000 times worse off than I was when I went in. I was very conscious of that, even as a 16-year-old. I was very aware of the fact that I did not operate correctly anymore. It was very easy for me to become overstimulated because the hospital was so quiet. I didn't know how to relate to people anymore. I also had this massive stigma now of being an ex-psychiatric patient who had lost a year of his life. And I was relocated to a halfway house. So I wasn't about to share with my peers like where I was living or what I had been through, because there was a lot of shame attached to that. So I then began to sort of internalize all this stuff and create a facade that would make me a little more appealing to other people. And so you begin to live this dual life, which I think a lot of people who suffer from trauma and abuse understand, that you sort of quarantine that stuff and then create something more palatable for the everyday world. And with that comes a lot of shame. And I lived that way for a long time. And then ultimately met my attorney who, when I began to learn more about the details of the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, and just your description of this supposedly therapeutic treatment, the chair, the strapping people down, it is a horror story. How could you not have kind of turned off the switch and go numb? I just think from a human standpoint, how else do you survive that? And how do you feel about other incidences of this, other treatments like this throughout the history of psychiatry? Because as I was reading it, I was thinking about going all the way back to, say, insulin shock therapy, coma therapy, lobotomies, ECT, which is still being practiced. And then, of course, at Mad in America, we write quite a bit about the harms of psychiatric drugs and all of that. Do you have thoughts on that? And is this sort of part of the arc of not healing, as your book is, but the sort of the history of psychiatric treatments in some way?
I was a 15-year-old. I didn't truly understand whether the doctors were trying to help us, and this was just this very painful treatment. Like, sometimes it was like, is this their form of surgery, like trying to help us, like psychic surgery, and it's just really painful? There was no explanation in my mind for what they were doing. It appeared to me to be something that seemed designed or felt designed to make us sick. But the bottom line, and this is something that's really crucial, I think, for people to walk away from this book and other things about, is that, and my dad states this later in the book, and I think it's just such a crucial paragraph or portion of the book, that psychiatrists hold a really powerful and very precious place in society, because you can't really hold up an MRI or an X-ray and point at a white spot and say, this is your depression, this is your anxiety. And in 6 months, you will see this gone, because this treatment that we will help you with. You have to simply inherently trust them. And my dad was a pilot, and he told my doctor, he said, look, I have no choice but to trust you the way my passengers trust me. And so because of that, there will always, and still remains to this day, this wonder in my mind of whether the doctors were trying to really help us. But then at the end of the day, I'm always thinking, who in their right mind would ever believe that sitting in a chair and facing a wall for 12 hours is supposed to help somebody with depression? Like, all these studies show that sunlight, spending time outside, is good for mental health, but yet I wasn't allowed to go outside for 5 to 6 months at a time. So there's so much evidence to show that empirically that this stuff was not good for us, yet they did it. So there's just this constant conflict, because nobody has ever sat down. No doctor was ever found guilty of wrongdoing. And none of this stuff was illegal. It's not illegal to strap somebody to a bed for months. It's not illegal to make a kid sit in a chair and face a wall for months. And that's something that's really important for people to understand as well. And so I'd see a therapist today. It took me a long time to even consider giving therapy another chance. And my therapist has never tried to medicate me. She has never tried to have me hospitalized or restrained or anything. Therapy for us is more about just talking and meditation and other things. So my sort of mantra that I want people to walk away from this book, because my goal with this book was not to try to demonize or stigmatize therapy. I want people to walk away from this book thinking more of, and I'm going to date myself here. Ronald Reagan had a quote from the 80s where he said, he was talking about the Cold War and trying to develop a relationship with the Russians. And he said, he has this phrase where he said, trust but verify. And so my mantra with therapy is trust but verify. It's like dating. It's no different than dating. When you sit down and meet with a therapist, if you don't feel some kind of chemistry, walk away. If they try to medicate you, walk away. It needs to be a relationship, and a relationship first based on trust. And once they earn that trust and don't expect you to simply give it to them, then you can give them little tiny cookies of a little more trust, a little more trust, a little more trust. And if at any point in time, just like a partner, they cross a line, then you back off or you walk away. And so it's really important, towards the end of this book, the reader will understand that I do see a therapist again, very reluctantly at the time, and still sometimes kind of reluctantly. But it is based very much on that statement of trust but verify.
I love that. That's the best advice to give anybody who's considering therapy, and the framing it in terms of just as a relationship. And also you're giving yourself agency. You're saying, I'm the person with control in this relationship.
And something I really want to emphasize for the parents that are listening is, do not under any circumstances force your child into therapy with somebody that they do not really like. They're teenagers, they're social creatures. And if they don't have some kind of bond or connection with this therapist, it's going to all be counterproductive. And look, even if you feel that instinct to do that, look at it from a monetary standpoint. You're throwing your money away because your kid's not being transparent with this person because they don't trust them. So if you want to get your money's worth out of therapy for your child, find them a therapist that they love and care about, or at least like, because then they're going to actually speak to them and share the things that matter. Do not force your child into therapy out of desperation or anything else. It will not work, and it's not fair.
So doubling back to the hospital that you were in, essentially what emerged was the story behind it, which was that chain of hospitals had been essentially corrupt and exploiting health insurance, and kept you there until your health insurance ran out. And that was the basis for the class action lawsuit, right? And all the against the hospitals and all the horror stories, everything that emerged in the midst of that.
Our hospital was closed down almost immediately. It was physically torn down. Nearly all the hospitals owned by that chain were. Like I said, only one person ever pled guilty. Only one person was ever found guilty, or pled guilty, I should say. And so shortly after our lawsuit, me, my attorney, and one of the people that I was in the hospital with were invited to speak in front of Congress. Ironically, it was by Senator Schumer. And this is back in the early to mid 90s. And I decided to not go. I just didn't want to be an ex-psychiatric patient anymore. I didn't want to be famous for that. I just was tired of talking about it. So my attorney and my friend went and spoke in front of Congress. There's still transcripts. This is during the Clinton era, when there was a lot of emphasis on trying to reform our medical care system. And really, nothing happened. There was a lot of good intended, but the troubled teen industry just continued on. I think in a lot of ways, it's morphed into these sort of wilderness camps and things that you hear about now, where instead of using the term psychiatric care, they use terms like wilderness camp or schools or other things to sort of camouflage the industry, and make it a little more palatable for parents and other people who are going to be signing kids into these places.
Going to wilderness and the valley. Let's dive into that part right now, if you don't mind, and how you're becoming a backpacking guide and your response to the beauty of nature. And that was one of the elements that really, really spoke to me, because your descriptions while you're in the hospital of having literal glimpses of the outside world. I think at one point you're in there and you're in the chair and you realize that while you couldn't see anything out your window, if you just kind of cocked your head a different way, you could sort of see a tree, and that was just one of the best parts of your day. It was like seeing that tree, and that speaks to something really profound. Like, we are all built to respond to nature, and when we're deprived of it, that's huge. And there's been a lot of research going into that. So if you could just describe, we spent all this time talking about the chair, and that's a massive, critical first chunk of your story and ongoing. But let's hear about the valley now.
So I grew up, in my very young, my youth, before my parents' divorce, my life was really idyllic. My dad was at the time really a wonderful dad, and he would take me on trips because he was a pilot, and we would go hiking in different places. And when he was home at our house in Southern California, we would go hiking in Southern California or go sailing. We would spend a lot of time outside. And that made the hospital, I think, even more traumatic because I couldn't go outside. That had always been my home, my happy place. So, yeah, when I was on chair, the security screens were so dense that I had to rock back and forth to sort of see the tree out the window. And yeah, I'll never forget those images. They still live in my mind. And the first time I went outside after 5 months is a moment I spent weeks writing that part of the book because I really wanted to emphasize what that was like for the reader. Because it was sort of like my second birth, to re-experience the outdoors through a very different set of eyes now. And as a 15-year-old, and so after the lawsuit, many years later, I was 21, 22 when I went through the lawsuit. I became a recluse and a computer gaming addict. I sort of took all my wounds from the hospital and did, when I wasn't forced to work because I would get monthly checks. I was not wealthy, but I was stable enough that I could not work. I built my sort of perfect world for a very wounded person, which for me involved no socializing, lots of games, lots of quiet time, no stimulus. I lived on 3 acres of land in the middle of nowhere in a huge house, 3,000 square foot house, all by myself. I let the weeds around my house completely camouflage the place. I was like Boo Radley, and it was dreamland for me. It was like paradise because nothing disturbed me. And so I lived in that place for a long time. And what I wound up ultimately sort of learning is that I began to deteriorate, having severed that cord from almost all social contact, with the exception of one really good friend who sort of made his way into my life. I began to sort of go mad. And that deterioration led me to a very, very close brush with suicide. And when I began changing my life after that, I always went back to the outdoors. Like, the one theme that always kept calling to me was the outdoors, the outdoors, the outdoors. And so as I slowly began to try to find a sense of normalcy in the world and try to build this healthy relationship with society and being out amongst people, for me, the best, easiest, and happiest place to do it was the outdoors. And so ultimately, and I won't ruin much of the story for people, I became a backpacking guide in Yosemite National Park. I was living in Texas at the time. I hadn't been to California in over 20 years. I hadn't seen my dad in 26 years. And so all this stuff begins to happen in a very quick progression. And so I relocate to California and become this backpacking guide in Yosemite. And so guiding at the time for me, I had sort of built this idea in my mind of what being a backpacking guide was. And it was It was in my imagination, sort of a fake it till you make it scenario where I imagined myself being the strong, capable guy that people really liked. And I was like, you know what? If I'm a guide, then I will be strong and capable and people will like me. And so I imagine guiding as being the sort of exercise and masculinity. I'd go out there and be like George Clooney, or something in the mountains. And so my backpacking boss is, her name in the book is Sandy. And Sandy, the woman who hired me when I met her, turned out to be very much not like that. She identified very much with this wounded part of me and recognized that wounded part of me as a very important part of why I needed to be a guide, which was sort of surprising to me. And so when I began guiding, what I discovered almost immediately was that it was not at all what I had imagined it would be. It was actually this wounded side of me that would make me a good guide, because what I discovered was that a lot of people were being called to Yosemite and called to nature because of their wounds, and they weren't really sharing that with us. And very briefly in the book, I share a story. I don't think I'll be spoiling much. If you think I will, then fast forward 30 seconds. But during one of our trips, it was early summer, late spring. The creeks are really high because the snow's still melting, and this is a half dome trip, and we're leaving from a trailhead called Sunrise Creek, which is right off the Tioga Road. And in the first 100 yards is this massive creek crossing, and it's very deep during that time of year. It's up to your chest, and I'm 6'2", and so we're ferrying packs across for the clients. And Sandy, my backpacking boss, she's this beautiful, tall, she's 6 feet tall, blonde woman, bigger than life. She's just this bigger. She's like Annie Oakley or something. And so she's ferrying packs across the river. She's helping me. And then this couple sits down, and this guy, the husband, is this big rock of a dude. He's just this mountain of a guy. And his wife is sitting next to him, and he's kind of hunched down, and she has his arm around him. And I'm like, we're at 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet. You can get some headaches up there. Some people get high altitude sickness, the beginnings of it. I was thinking maybe he doesn't feel well. So Sandy walks over to him as I'm ferrying packs across, and then I see his body kind of shuddering, and Sandy sort of pats his back, and he's clearly crying. And I'm like, what's going on? I've only been a guide for like a couple weeks at this time, maybe a month or two. And so I finished ferrying packs across, and as I'm crossing the river to go back towards them, because they're the only 3 people on the other side of the creek, they all 3 stand up together, and he's clearly weeping. And Sandy steps to the side, and his wife and him hold hands and walk into the river together. I might start tearing up here because it was just such this amazing moment. And so they walk into the river together, and they very meaningfully sort of cross this creek together. And Sandy sort of comes in behind them, and I'm looking at Sandy like, what's going on? Is everything okay? I'm new to guiding. I don't know what's going on. They get to the other side of the creek and get up, and they're putting their shoes and socks back on. And I look at Sandy, and I asked her, I said, what's going on? Is everything okay? And she looked at me like, oh, you're the new guy. Like, you don't get this yet, do you? And I was like, get what? And she said, his brother drowned crossing a river when he was young, and he booked this trip to finish crossing a river for his brother. And I lost it. And Sandy just looked at me with a smile on her face, and she said, honey, this is what we do. Like, this is what we do. And I was hooked. I was like, this, sign me up. This is the job for me. And so what I realized immediately was that 60, 70, 80% of our clients were people like that, were people who had come to Yosemite knowingly or unknowingly in search of some sort of transcendental experience, some sort of healing or something else. And that my wounds, my past is what made me a good guide. And that wasn't stuff that I needed to leave behind. It was stuff that I needed to share. And so through my clients, I began to learn that my wounds are not unique. Like, they're unique to me, and my experience is unique to me. but we are all as human beings wounded. That is the human condition. And that we as people will never really truly begin to heal until we open the doors of that place with someone else who really we feel like is a safe place and will understand us and give us a community. And my community was my clients. And so guiding became this huge mechanism of healing for me that I had never anticipated. And that ultimately is what gave me the courage to sort of give therapy maybe another chance. And then I had this event take place at the very end of the book on a guided trip where my life changed, this other guy's life changed, and ultimately was the impetus for me writing the book. So guiding for me, nature itself, I always tell my clients, right now I'm sitting in this room that my wife and I call our study. Got a closet, 4 walls, and a desk and a chair. This is not our home. Our home is outside. We as human beings evolved to sleep under rocks and trees on the ground. We are very new to this urban life, and our psyches and our bodies and our emotions have not caught up. We don't evolve that quickly. We evolve physically very quickly, but we do not evolve psychologically and emotionally very quickly. And so I would take clients out for 4 days in the backcountry who were absolutely terrified, never slept in a tent or a sleeping bag. And by the end of the trip, they're running into lakes, skinny dipping, and they're like, aha, they're so happy they're sleeping under the stars. And so it was really cool to me to see how quickly that side of people comes out. And so I love that experience. For me, being a guide, it never gets old because I get to see Yosemite through new eyes. Every trip, I get to see people see Yosemite for the first time. And that makes it new to me every time. And so the joy of that is something that will forever keep me healing. And it always provides me a community of people who sort of, feel like a family.
2 things. One is I've only been to Yosemite once. It was for a week. And it is honestly the most beautiful place on earth. Well, the most beautiful place on earth I've ever visited. But beyond that, what really hit me was your characterization of people, everybody having a story. Because this is one of the things I feel like your book really grapples with, is this idea. We have this assumption that, there are people who, have broken parts and need to be healed. And then there are people who are whole. And that's ridiculous. Because everybody's broken. Everybody needs to heal. Whatever happened to us, it's different from whatever happened to somebody else. But it doesn't mean that we're not on some lifelong path of healing. And that's something else you said that really hit me, really, really spoke to me. You said there is no finish line to healing. That's true of all of us. And so much in your book spoke to me and hit me just right in the gut, in the heart, wherever you want. But those were 2 pieces of it, because I also feel like everybody has a story, so we should, again, be listening to everybody. But beyond that, I think in terms of storytelling, it's the intimate that becomes universal. Like, your story of trauma isn't the same as someone else's, but you tell it, and that allows them to feel less alone.
So my writing workshop was founded and managed by a man named Clive Matson. And Clive still runs a writing workshop. He's an absolutely lovely human being. And Clive, he's an old beat poet, and he's always quoting beat poets. And so early days in the writing workshop for me, he always said that my writing was so intimate. And he gave me some writing advice that became sort of the mantra for how I chose to write my book as I went back and rewrote it multiple times. And it's an old quote by Allen Ginsberg that says, "Great writing makes the private world public." And that for me was so crucial, because I realized that there were parts of the book that I absolutely did not want to write about. There's one chapter in particular I do not like. I knew that day that I was going to have to write it. And I'll name the chapter. It's called "Like Oil and Pennies." And that chapter to me is filled with the most shameful thing I've ever done in my life. It's something I still beat myself up for to this day, but I knew that I had to share it because people who suffer from trauma and abuse and PTSD and other things, will read that and be like, that's me. I get it. And it's not until we share those things that we give other people permission to share those things. And that's something I learned from my backpacking boss, Sandy, because she said, I hired you because you're so good at giving people permission to be emotional about the beauty of the outdoors. We're giving people permission. That's what our job as guides is. Yeah, we monitor their water intake, and we patch their blisters, and we make their margaritas and other stuff. But like, really what we're doing is we're giving them permission to connect deeply and emotionally to the outdoors. And so that was really my goal with my book, because I agree with you. We are all wounded. I had a good friend in high school who he wanted a Camaro for graduation, and he wound up getting like a Toyota, and he was absolutely crushed. And at that time, I just got out of a psychiatric hospital. My mom abused me. My dad neglected me. I'd been through a halfway house, and here's this guy complaining about not getting a Camaro. And I remember telling myself, I was like, don't judge him. Like, don't get upset. Like, this is his Mount Everest. This is his psychiatric hospital. This is the pinnacle of his suffering right now, And so I think that's something that we all need to keep in mind for each other, is to have this compassion and not make suffering a contest. It's not a contest. Just hold some compassion for other people. It's easy to poo-poo somebody else's suffering, but it's when we really hold each other in our hands and say, hey, I see you, that we all sort of give each other a safe space.
Banning Lyon, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been profound, a truly moving conversation on so many levels. And thanks to all you listeners out there for tuning in to the Mad in America podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.